I'm Chinese by ethnicity. Before I came to Redeemer, I worked at a Korean church. I worked in a Korean church for about 3.5 years, and before that, I worked for 3 years part-time in a Korean American church. And I had sort of become, after all those years, I sort of like paid my dues, and I was like the token honorary non-Korean, sort of like okay to hang out with, the Koreans. And after a while, I became very acclimated to the Korean way of doing things. I became very comfortable with a certain expression and a certain style and a certain manner of, Korean spirituality. One of the things, if you've ever spent time in a Korean church, you realize very, very quickly that there is, in a Korean church, a very strict social and ecclesiastical hierarchy in the church. Younger people defer to older people. Non-ordained staff, they defer to ordained staff. Deacons defer to elders, and everyone actually defers to the senior pastor. One of the difficult things for me was that there was a certain rigidness in a lot of social relationships. I didn't have any confidants. I didn't have any close friends in the congregation because that was outside of the social hierarchy. It was sort of deemed inappropriate for me to have close friends in the congregation because I was an ordained minister. One of the great things, however, that I discovered was that there was a very clear and a very structured and a well-understood, sort of commonly understood sense of social relationships. Everyone knew how to relate to one another. There wasn't, a lot of sort of like organizational chaos because everyone knew who reported to who. Everyone knew who listened to whom. On the one hand, the hierarchy was sometimes actually really overbearing and authoritative, and it could be abused. But on the other hand, it was very orderly, and it was very well defined, and it was very understood. There was a certain kind of comfort and a social lubrication that came from the fact that everyone knew how to relate to each other. Everyone knew what was expected of them. Then I came to Redeemer. The Eastern world in general tends to value hierarchy and a sort of a highly, clearly defined social order. Submission, deference, respect, corporate loyalty is highly valued. That's why, for instance, in kung fu movies, that's why in kung fu movies it's always about revenge. You've offended, me, my sister, my brother, my mother, my father, right? My uncle, my cousin, my fourth grade teacher, and most importantly, my kung fu school. You have offended all those things, and that's why we're going after you. The Western world, on the other hand, the Western world tends to value expressiveness and entrepreneurialism and activism. It tends to value individuality and sort of individual creative thought, which is why, for instance, many of our movies end with two people who choose love or they choose freedom over duty. Or there's a tendency, for instance, a lot of movies is basically about the search for creative expressiveness in light of an otherwise mundane and very boring world. One of the first people I met when I came to Redeemer was Carrie Jo Cates. And there are many, many mornings where the two of us would come early and we sit down, we talk, and we have coffee and sort of chat, just sort of start the day early in the morning. And I very distinctly remember times when we'd be talking, and she would say something that was, it was not inherently disrespectful, or it wasn't sort of intentionally confrontational, just honest and truthful and sort of forthright. But I remember there are many times in the course of the conversation where I would think to myself, I'd say, okay, so you're saying these things, and I think there's some validity to it, but do you know who I am? You know the R-E-V in front of my name? That stands for Reverend, as in the Reverend John Lin. Let me teach you let me teach you a Korean word, 목사님. That basically means senior, pastor. That means there is some kind of social order that's not really working out here, and let me sort of tell you about that. Here's another example. The Korean church that I was in was one where there were many small businesses. And many of those businesses were dry cleaning businesses. And so what would always happen in our church is one family that owned a dry cleaning business would, a family would essentially adopt a pastor, and they would volunteer to do all of their dry cleaning. So in the span of 3.5 years, I didn't pay for dry cleaning once. I didn't even know what dry cleaning cost. I come to New York oh my gosh, what's this? It's so expensive. I've been here for 3 years. No one's yet offered to do my dry cleaning. And at first I was like, oh my gosh, these people are like, so anarchistic, like what's going on here? Like no one cares about their pastor, no one loves me, they don't like honor me or whatever. And you know what I discovered? What I discovered over many, many conversations with Carrie Jo Cates and just through being around Redeemer and in its sort of different contexts is that while there may not be the same sort of system of deference and the same system of respect, there is a relational fluidity. There is a certain honesty. There is a certain openness and a warmth that I can experience now that I wasn't able to experience before. I can present my ideas more freely now than I ever could before. I mean, the problem is like people could do the same thing to me, but there's a certain kind of openness and there's a warmth in relationships that I've experienced now that I've never experienced before. While the Korean church, on the one hand, can become authoritarian, it's also very ordered. There's a certain comfort and a social lubrication, a social understanding of how to relate to one another. In the Western church, the Western church, so to speak, in the Western church, there may be a little bit more fluidity, a little bit more uncertainty sometimes in social relationships and interactions, but there's an openness. And there is an expressiveness much more than anything I've experienced before. I mean, when I was in the Korean church, I spent 3.5 years in this particular church, about 400 people, which is not all that many people. And to this day, I mean, most of the people there, I don't actually know their first name. I mean, I just know them as like Deacon Park or, like Mr. Kim or, Elder Lee who owns the dry cleaner or whatever. According to Paul, what divides us as a community is when we begin to normativize. And we begin to absolutize certain experiences that we've had as a form of self-promotion and self-branding, and that's what divides us. Instead of, A, recognizing that we all too often make too much of our experiences, that we build up our own gifts as normative for all, or B, affirmatively celebrating that others have had unique experiences and gifts themselves. In other words, we fail to realize that all creation is fallen and needs to be redeemed. And therefore, we value our own experience